for this Equally Well program that we're doing. In actual fact, we now have New Zealand evidence that people who with a diagnosis of mental health or addictions potentially will die 20 years earlier than the rest of the population. Now, how bloody outrageous is that? It's outrageous because they've been treated as schizophrenic, not as a diabetic. So I just think we've got some really clean-up work to do in our sector. And like you, the old social workers, you can't put them down. I think you're right. I actually think it's all of our responsibility as citizens, as people that work in the system, people that use these systems, to actually make the changes, because no one's going to do it otherwise. So I just think we've got to really sharpen our act up, really, as people who care about this stuff. Just as you did in that movie. You know, you sharpened the act up. You know, you said, because am I right that the court evolved out of that, the housing project, was around about the same time, or?
Oh yeah, other way around. I was meeting Arthur at the time. Court was being set up.
Right. So a major social housing reform or social housing program at the same time. That's the subtle story underlying this stuff. And that's social change, you know. Anyway, that wasn't one of the questions, but that was my little rave. One of the things I'm really interested in is normal and not normal, you know, and I think that came out in the movie, it comes out in many of these movies. It's kind of like, it's the coming out story or not. It's kind of, how do we begin to talk about this in a way when it's, many people I know who are saying, I just want to be treated like a normal person, the same boring bloody lives, getting up, taking the kids to school and doing everything else, you know. And that doesn't make a news story, it doesn't make an exciting life story. So how do we do that bit of stuff?
Actually, a lot of news stories take a humanistic angle where people do that on a daily basis, and they are actually quite boring stories. Anybody who looks at the Women's Weekly or New Idea will see that they have people who live boring lives. They are, and I encourage people to live boring lives. What I would say, it's not a matter of normal and abnormal, it's a matter of usual and unusual. If someone exhibits unusual behaviour, you notice it. If someone, for example, stands on the toilet seat when they're having a crap, that's an unusual behaviour. If someone sits down to do the same thing, that's a usual behaviour and therefore more acceptable, apparently.
Something James said just put me off my stride there. I was going to say something, but I had sort of gone out of my head. It was really this business about normal and abnormal. And yeah, like one of my roles as a nurse and as a nurse academic is writing stuff that tries to get people in the nursing profession to think about some of these constructs. I recently wrote an editorial in which I talked about the fact that it shouldn't be thought of as abnormal to have a mental illness. When we look at the statistics on the lifetime statistics on mental illness, we should think of it as something that is normal and part of the life course. We do that with physical illness. We don't say it's unusual or abnormal to have a physical illness for at least a period of your life. We should do the same with mental illness if we think it's a meaningful concept. And for the nurses that I was writing for, my message was, and these were what we call general nurses, people who work in the general hospital, etc., was that you are also a mental health nurse. Mental health is part of everything you do. You should be able to respond to mental distress, identify signs of depression. Maybe you need to involve other people, etc., but it's part of what you do. And I think there's a kind of a wider message there too, which is that mental health, mental illness is part of life. It's not something to be kind of marginalised away as about what other people experience. It's something that we will all experience ourselves, in ourselves or in a family member at some time in our lives.
So, I guess from my perspective, no such thing as normal. So let's do some interaction with the audience. So how many people have breakfast in the morning? Show of hands. Okay, so for us, that would be considered norm. How many people don't have breakfast in the morning? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so for you, that wouldn't be. That for you is the norm. So I guess the norm is depending on how one sees it, which is exactly what you got. Which is?
Sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't.
Breakfast, yeah, exactly. And that's the norm, right? Yeah. So it's not mental health, but it's a nice example of how, you know, norms can be individually tailored to whoever we are. Where was I going with that? What was the last thing you just said?
I don't know, but it's good.
Yes. So when we use the word mental health or mental illness, we tend to always look at the other person and never kind of ourselves. Now, don't know about you, but recently I lost someone, and in that moment of sadness, it did bring some depression. And I think that at some point in our life, we will experience some kind of trigger that will impact on our own mental health. And I guess from my perspective, it's about people coming together. Hopefully, people have got even those ability to have that to support people, but also being able to do it in a way that can be reflected in the media, such as the movies as well.
Two thoughts. First of all, I found in the years of being in a church community where there were psych patients, as we knew them, and they were in our homes and in our lives, and there was some extraordinary wisdom which came on occasions, and it turned on its head for me the notion of who's wise and who's crazy. And I think that was part of being open to seeing someone as a person, and which is what we've been talking about. And I think if we see a person, not as an illness, then we can open up ourselves to some of those amazing experiences. The other thing I was going to say, James, it was carrying on from what you've said, and it's gone right out of my head, so maybe I'll pass on to Mike and it might come back to me.
Yeah, I think I mean, we're going around in circles on a lot of things. I think it all comes down to very basic concepts like humanity and dignity and compassion. And people are different and complex, and we're all broken in some way. And the worst people are those people who don't think they are broken. But, to be a human is to be a broken person in some ways. And I think compassion comes when you realise you are in some unique way broken, and that everybody around you is uniquely broken as well. And then you stop feeling the need to make that other person like you, but rather just to share your perspective and your life and your compassion with that other person, and grant them the dignity of doing the same back to you.
Yes, the other thought was about those who are normal and those who are not, and I think, James, you talked about those who, those wanting to be normal, but I think that everyone wants to be different, and psychiatric illness or not, everyone wants to be different, everyone wants to be special, everyone's unique, and there may be those that want to just have that boring life with those ordinary routines, but those who've got that want something special and different. We all want what we can't have.
And just very quickly, it kind of reminds me of a quick story about the idea of norm and not norm. When I was working in Australia, I had a patient come up to me and say to me, when I talk about God in this hospital, people think that I'm crazy, but if I talk about it in the community, they think I'm a Christian. So, it's a really interesting way of seeing how those two things can be seen.
I think there's something really powerful, isn't it, the way that probably the biomedical industry has kind of commodified the human condition and made it into a psychopathy, so the DSM, whatever we're up to now, is kind of like naughty children syndrome, and crying at the death of a loved one becomes a something. So that we are absolutely at this edge of if you like, the science driving an agenda, and increasingly we're seeing that all around us. So I think something about holding on to our compassion, our humanity, our love, our care, and all of those sorts of things, and we don't talk about it. you're absolutely, we just don't talk about it. We just kind of like, oh, actually, I'm a nurse, I don't talk about that. So there's something about how do we reclaim our language of caring for other people and not being seen as wuzzes, but actually seeing as actually this is our new mental health intervention. It's kind of like caring for people. So I'm not sure what we do about that, and I think there's probably a movement really to be started. But just thinking about this, and I don't know how we're going for time, Ainsley, but I'm really interested in, I think every generation has a movie or a something that drove them. I'm really interested in what was yours, what was your mental health movie or mental health gallery that you saw, or the book that you read that that did it for you?
I think Beautiful Mind was the one that came to mind, the story of the guy who worked at the university and of course won, I think, the Bell Prize and so on and so forth. I think that's the one that stood out for me. It was nice to get away from the violence and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's the one for me.
I can't name a film, Marion, because I'm not really that much of a film watcher. No problem with films, but I read a lot more than I watch films. There's a story that stands out for me, which I think captures a lot of the way I think about mental illness. It's rather an old story, but it still rings true to me. It's a story by Janet Frame called Horses Not People. And I'm not sure if it's in any of her collections or not, but I know that you can get it free online if you just Google that title. It's been published in the New Yorker, and I think you can still get it through their website. Horses Not People. I won't tell you what's in it. You read it for yourself. I strongly encourage you to do that. But I've given it to students, often recommend it to people to read. It's a marvellous story.
Obviously there's going to be a bias because I quite like that movie. If you've watched the movie recently, you might have to answer your question, Winnie the Pooh, I guess, because if you've seen that in the media, I encourage you to go into Google. They did an analysis around mental illness within the 100-acre woods. So good old Piglet's got anxiety, Eeyle's got depression, Owl's got